about the history of Darwin's birthday party, because some of you were here when this started, and others of you are much younger than I am, and so weren't here when this all started. In 1992, when I very first came to London with my then husband James Mallet, we started a London Evolution Group, which is a forerunner of the CEE, because we realized that across London, evolutionary biologists were in lots of different institutions, and we didn't really have an opportunity to get together and do things together in a way that crossed between those institutions so we could share ideas. So that group was started. And in 1993, 30 years ago, we had the very first Darwin's birthday party, and it was just a party at our house. Because it was good for evolutionary biologists to get together, but it was also really important to have more parties. And so we had a party at our house. And the very first two-person lecture happened the next year in 1994 at the Linnaean Society, and the two people who spoke there were Simon Conway Morris and Derek Briggs. And they didn't disagree, but they did agree that Stephen Jay Gould got it all wrong. So that was important. There have been some exciting Darwin's birthday parties, one of which was between John Maynard Smith and Stuart Kauffman about life on the edge of chaos, about which an editorial was written in Nature, which was entitled Polite Row About Models. In 1998, Jim Lake and Tom Cavalier-Smith talked about the Tree of Life. In 2001, Michael Foote and Blair Hedges talked about the phylogenetic fuse and the origin of life and its evolution on our planet. And over dinner, Blair Hedges was hit on the head with an inflatable hammer by one of the followers of Michael Foote. So things have not been without incident. But I wanted to say something tonight because this is the 25th year that Darwin's birthday party has been held at the Natural History Museum. And I think it's great that it's held here and that the museum is a place where evolutionary biologists from around London can get together, talk about things about which they differ, and talk about things about which they think the same. Because one of the tenets of the original Darwin's birthday party idea, which Jim and I had at the very beginning, was that it will be a place where we would have speakers who perhaps had slightly different views about things, to show not only us ourselves that holding differing views is not a bad thing, but actually for students in the audience who could also see that holding different views doesn't mean you can't have polite and interesting debate and still maintain those differing views. So happy Darwin's birthday, and have a lovely 25th Darwin's birthday party here at the museum. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Sandy. Fantastic to hear the story of Darwin's birthday event. I actually went to the 1995 Maynard Smith-Kauffman debate, and it wasn't really very polite, an incredibly exciting, inspirational debate for a PhD student to visit. So the CEE, as you know, is an organisation devoted to bringing people together to discuss issues of importance to evolution and ecology, and also to the act of being a scientist. And we encourage you all to sign up to the mailing list if you're not already, join CEE, be part of our events. And I want to thank as well the people that have helped make this, always make Darwin's birthday fantastic, which is the Natural History Museum for hosting us, who also contribute a lot of cash towards the payment for the drinks and the room and all of the administration that goes into organising this. Also I need to thank UCL, who helped to pay for the dinner for the speakers afterwards, and also to the Royal Society, who very generously have sponsored this event as well. I think at least two people from the Royal Society here. Put your hands up. There's Andrew Dunn and Lucy Wyatt, I believe. Is that right? So nice to see you. Obviously the Royal Society is very interested in the application of science to policy and the role of scientists in contributing to rational debate and informed debate about key issues. And that brings me on to the subject of tonight's debate, or tonight's discussion, which is very much one that is brought back very sharply to people like myself, who have to, or whose duty is to talk to undergraduates as well as postgraduates about the ecological emergency and the climate emergency. And it's been brought into sharp focus by, I'd say around 10 years ago when I gave lectures to students. They would be shocked and upset, and they would be like, what can we do, what can we do? Okay, and now, 10 years later, they're saying to us, the lecturers and the postgraduates in our organisation, CEE, but UCL, they're saying, What are you doing about it? You can't just tell us this stuff. We know this stuff already. What are you doing to affect change, to cause change? And of course, that's a discussion that we then take throughout the coffee room, to lunchbox at CEBA, and across UCL, and I'm sure your own institutions. And we start to ask ourselves these very genuine, very earnest questions. What are we doing as scientists? What is our role as citizens at a time of urgent ecological and climate emergency? What are we doing to make ourselves good ancestors? Is it still enough to engage purely with government, or to engage purely through routes of influencing policy, when a lot of the policy has already been decided and agreed on by government, but is failing to be enacted? If you look through history, you think about things like the civil rights movements in America, in the USA, you think about the suffragette movement in Europe, UK and the rest of Europe. There were points when clearly government was no longer acting in the interests of society, of individuals. At what point do each of us as scientists decide that if we are engaging only with government, we're no longer engaging with enough of the argument to make a difference? So these are the kind of questions that I would say on a weekly basis are being discussed in our organisation, the Centre for Biodiversity and Environment Research. We have constant discussions asking ourselves, what more should we be doing? Is it enough to engage with policy alone, or do we need to be engaging in direct activism, or engaging directly with people who are engaged in activism? I think that's particularly important at the moment, given we can see evidence from across Europe and the US that there are attempts being made to make civil actions and protests much less respectable, certainly, and in some cases even criminal. So clearly there's something going on, and we have to decide at what point government is no longer acting in the interests of the future of our children. And with that, I think I've probably said plenty, and I'll hand over to the other director of CEE, Dr. Idris Endres, who's going to introduce our two fantastic speakers today, or people who engage in discussion. And there's plenty of time after the speakers. We've made sure there's at least 40 minutes for discussion from the floor, for discussion with the speakers. Thanks very much, everyone, and let's wish you the same.
Hi everyone, so my name is Andres. I'm the co-director of CEE, and I'm very happy to introduce two outstanding speakers today who are going to tell us about their particular view of two different ways of answering this question, right? How can scientists contribute to make things better at times like now? For those of you that maybe haven't been to, haven't had a Darwin debate live for a few years, we're going to have the speakers. They're going to give each a presentation. They're not going to answer questions, because the idea here is to engage in conversation. Then we'll have a debate between them, so a conversation between them, and then we'll open the event to all of you to ask questions and comments and so on. So I'm gonna I'm gonna read this because I really don't want to say this wrong. I want to introduce the first of our speakers, Professor Richard Gregory. He's the head of monitoring at the RSPB Center for Conservation Science and an honorary professor at the Center for Biodiversity and Environmental Research at University College London. He has published on a range of topics, from study design to citizen science, and he's a winner of the European Bird Census Council Award in 2013. And he is the Unibio Press Award for Ornithological Science in 2011. And he's going to tell us about working on policy or advising policy. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you for that kind introduction, and it's really really exciting to be here, to be invited to this really important debate about science, policy and activism, and I'm going to provide both a personal overview, a personal story, not my personal story of how I've come into science and the sort of science I do, and also to think about the role of a scientist in this emerging world. And so I'm going to present that sort of one way of thinking about the role of a scientist and things to consider, and I think Tristram will then sort of provide the counter to that. So what I'm going to talk about is translating biodiversity science into conservation policy. That's what I do, that's what my day-to-day job is. So I work for the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds. That's a big green charity in the UK, working, as it says here, with this vision for a world that's richer in nature. A world that is richer in nature for people, for the climate, for nature itself. And we're very much at the heart of what we do. Our mission and cause is about tackling those twin crises, the biodiversity and the climate crisis. But perhaps unusually for a green NGO, we have a large science team, an in-house science team. We have a big policy team. We have a lot of practitioners working for the RSPB as well. So there might be something like 2,000 people employed by the RSPB. The science team has 60 or 70 professional permanent scientists, with PhDs. We have a similar, really highly skilled policy advocacy team. These are expert policy makers, and we have huge numbers of practitioners out there kind of making action work on the ground, saving nature with a focus on birds, but broadly biodiversity. And what I wanted to think about first was kind of, well, what is it we want to change and how do you go about changing it? So we talked about the need for change and the need for urgency, but of course we need to think about how we're going about doing that. So here's a couple of examples of how we think about what you want to change and then how you might change it. So as scientists, I think it's really important for us to understand something more about this policy cycle, the thing we call more often now as sort of a theory of change. So the policy cycle, as you can see, goes from some identification of a problem to some formulation and placement of policy, adoption and implementation, and then a sort of monitoring process there. It's this sort of a virtuous circle, and often you'll see now, for example, within the Convention on Biodiversity, they have a specific theory of change that they use to think about how they might bring about change. So the theory of change is what we recognise as a logic framework for delivering change in society. So that goes from having sort of mission and vision and objectives to activities and monitoring. So I think as scientists, we perhaps this is unfamiliar to some of you. I guess it was unfamiliar to me as I moved from a scientist to somebody who works very much in the policy science interface. But having some sense of where we're trying to get to, the levers, the mechanisms, the barriers, is really important to achieve things. And the RSPB, as in the introduction, the RSPB has something called the RSPB Centre for Conservation Science. That's where I work. I'm part of the science team there. And we have a similar sort of theory of change, which describes our kind of model of operation in the world. And we're operating in this fashion to deliver conservation solutions. Conservation solutions for people, for climate, for biodiversity, for equity. We're trying to do the best we can in terms of moving forward. And we're being increasingly propositional. So I think this is a really important thing to think about, such that if we want to bring about change, I think it's really important that we might provide some of the stepping stones and some of the visions about what that change looks like and how you might go on a journey to get there. So being propositional is really important. And the RSPB's model goes from kind of knowing the important problems in the world, kind of the prioritisation of conservation problems. I'm talking about kind of conservation biodiversity here, to knowing the causes. We do quite a lot of ecological work, sort of detective Sherlock Holmesy type stuff to try and understand, why is a species declining, why is a disease affecting a particular species. And then we're trialing solutions and we're kind of monitoring the outcomes to see if they work. So this is our sort of virtual circle, describing how we go about doing our conservation science and how we want to affect change at the end of it. But one thing you need to start to ask yourself is about whether you're inside the tent and making this change or whether you're outside that tent. So here's tent, and this is about thinking whether you are going to work inside track within the rational, logical processes of government function, of policy making, with politicians or organisations, or are you outside the tent? And it's quite a big question to ask yourself. Are you inside the tent or are you outside the tent? Are you sort of pulling out the tent pegs and lobbing rocks at this tent, or are you in the centre of it, where the decisions and the influences, where the levers of change are being discussed? And you need a really intimate understanding of how that operates and relationships there to bring about change. So for scientists, I think it is important to think about, are you inside this tent or are you outside? And I think the other thing here is to think about what kind of scientist you are. So there's a lovely book written by an American called The Honest Broker, and this describes a 4-box model. Everybody loves a 4-box model, obviously, and it talks about the different roles of a scientist in that science, in the politics space. So many of us might think of ourselves as the pure scientist. The pure scientist there doesn't muddy their hands. They don't get into the dirty sort of messy world of politics and policy making and all those real life things that are there. They do their own science, and they do that, quite often with a specific objective, and they're doing it because it will at some point have great societal benefit. They're doing some great things, pure science that will benefit the world. The other types of scientists here have these different labels, and each of these other 3 squares actually are defined by an engagement with the policy world. These people are engaging with policymakers, decision makers at different levels and kinds in order to try and bring their science and their scientific knowledge and expertise to bring about, affect change in an objective, evidence-based fashion. So the science arbiter is the type of scientist who is providing answers to questions that are raised in debate, that they're specifically not directing the debate, they're thinking about responding in a neutral sort of fashion to policy questions, decision-maker questions. The issue advocate is much more taking a position, that they represent a group or a particular view, and they're obviously advocating a particular outcome based upon their expertise and their knowledge and so forth. And the honest broker, at the bottom there of policy alternatives, it is sort of the example where the role of the scientist is to consider all of the different policy options that might be available to you, the different decisions that could be made in close contact and in discussion with those policymakers and decision makers, and also setting out potential new avenues of consideration in terms of those decisions that are made. So the honest broker is a little bit, like the role that Professor Lord May described, the role of a scientist. He described a situation where, the role of the scientist should be to provide information in an honest broker-like fashion in order for the decision makers and others to make decisions about. So that was a vision of how a scientist should operate. And it's important to think about where you sit, where each of you here, which box would you describe yourself do you sit in? And increasingly, it's not tenable just to be a pure scientist. And even when you think of yourself as a pure scientist, you possibly aren't, because in your grant writing and your funding, in what you're trying to achieve, it's value driven, it's subjective and value driven from the start. So that's a 4-box model. But jumping back to the beginning, it's a personal story. So I want to tell you something about me and my story, how I got into that science policy area, space. And this is me. I'm about 2 years old, I'm under 2 years old, and I'm bird watching in Cornwall. And I've got a book, and I've memorised all the birds in the book, and I'm telling everybody what the different birds are. And essentially that's what I do now, and I'm paid for it. That's what I do. I don't do anything more. But that's the beginnings, and I had a passion for sort of birds and bird watching, and that grew into a deeper understanding of ecology and science, biodiversity. So that's always fired me up. And jumping forward slightly, what I did in terms of my degree and education, I did a degree in ecology at York at a time when there was a fantastic, there's probably a fantastic team there now, but at that time there were some brilliant people there, Lawton and Professor Fitter and all sorts of people there at the time, and they were amazing, and kind of they opened a world to me of ecology, particularly theoretical ecology and biodiversity, that I found really fascinating. And that pushed me on, and I was lucky to land a PhD at Oxford, which then moved forward again, and I was studying ecology and epidemiology, in fact, and parasitology. So I had that sort of academic career and moving in that fashion. I had a junior research fellowship there, but it wasn't enough for me because I wanted to have applied, I wanted to have some impact in the world, to have applied use of the science I was doing. So what I did, which was frowned upon at the time, I'm sure, was to jump ship. And I joined an applied conservation, something called the British Trust of Ecology, in their science team, to work on bird monitoring. So the BTO is a scientific organisation working on the conservation and science of birds in the UK. So I jumped ship. I started working in biodiversity monitoring and working on things like biodiversity surveillance and monitoring of bird populations. I set up this scheme called the Breeding Bird Survey, a stratified random, quite neatly designed breeding bird survey scheme in the UK. Started to run that, and that starts then to tell you things about how biodiversity, in this case the bird population, is changing through time, and we can model change for different species, and we're starting to understand how the environment's changing, why it's changing, thinking about pointers that are driving that change, and kind of policy responses in order to change that situation, to recover nature. The picture here shows you a lot of bird populations, a lot of butterflies, plants, insects, just about everything. It has declined, particularly in farmed habitat over the last 50, 100 years in the UK. So I was doing that, and I was also winding these schemes out, getting schemes set up in bits of Europe and Africa as well. So bird monitoring like that can tell you something about how nature is changing, how the state of nature is changing. And I started developing with others these sort of wild bird indicators, composite geometric mean indicators of population abundance change through time, like living planet indices, but it's for a finer scale. And they tell us things about woodland birds are declining in the UK to a small degree, farmland birds and other farmland wildlife has really crashed. And that's completely coincident with rapid changes in farming methodologies, particularly in the 70s and 80s, and some lessening of that now. And building those statistics and promoting them kind of led to their adoption as sort of official statistics by the UK government. So these aren't just statistics that are sort of esoteric use. These are the official statistics that the Environment Minister has to publish every year and report to Parliament, report to the country on the status of wildlife and how it's changing. Birds are part of a number of different indicators. So I was developing these indicators. I did the same in Europe, working with partners right across Europe to build biodiversity indicators across Europe. And they tell us things about generally the common forest birds in Europe, like this amazing corfinch, very big beak on it. They're doing relatively well. Their population trends over the last 40 years or so are relatively stable in Europe. And that's largely driven by the fact that most European countries, unlike the UK, have something approaching kind of 40–50% forest cover, and that forest cover is increasing, and forest is being managed. So it tells us something about forest birds in Europe, but it shows us this picture again. Farmland birds within the EU and wider Europe have kind of crashed in a similar fashion to what we've seen in the United Kingdom, and that's driven by land use change. We know that land use change is the big global driver of biodiversity loss, often linked to food production, as you can imagine. And again, this information here, this has contributed to the adoption of wild bird indicators in the EU and in a range of European countries. I've done the same in the UK, working with the State Nature Partnership to set that up, to tell us something about abundance change within a range of different kingdoms of species, hundreds of species, around 1,000 species in this abundance indicator. It tells us something about how biodiversity is changing, why it's changing, and then what we can do about it. So I've built biodiversity industries like that, and while I've been doing that, I've attempted as much as I can to publish in the peer review the methodologies so that they have scientific scrutiny, so that they have the credibility, and we can then promote them in that science policy interface for decision makers to use, because the science is the highest quality science. The other thing at the time then that affected me was this lovely little essay that John Weems wrote back in 2009 or so. And this is a little essay talking about biodiversity monitoring. And the title there is "Monitoring is a Dirty Word." And what John identified, John, famous American ecologist, was that biodiversity monitoring was just not sexy. Scientists sort of generally saw monitoring with great disdain. It was a waste of time, and it got no respect. And monitoring, because the world views kind of short-termism responses over long-term responses, it was also viewed as expensive and things. So John wrote this lovely essay about biodiversity monitoring, and it struck me because I was so invested in it, and it spurred me on to carry on in this career of biodiversity monitoring that was often seen with disdain. I just wanted to read you the end of this chapter, this little BES essay. This is what John wrote, and I think it's really beautifully written. And he says, "Monitoring is how we keep track of how nature is doing, and the indications right now are that nature is not doing well. There is much at stake, and monitoring is too important to be relegated backwards to science. It demands the same attention to design, data quality, analytical rigour, and objective interpretation that are the fabric of mainstream science, and it should merit the same respect." So John's essay really kind of spurred me on, encouraged me to carry on in this endeavour to develop the monitoring of biodiversity and to use that for positive change. And I've done that, as I mentioned, sort of in terms of how it's been taken up by policy. This is very much inside the tent sort of work. It's inside track advocacy and policy. The information, the indicators I've described are sort of part of the UK biodiversity indicators and the England biodiversity indicators. Parliament has to report on them. I've been involved in writing a whole series of post notes. These post notes are kind of science policy, quite simplified science policy information to help MPs, parliamentary people, civil servants and others kind of understand quite complex science in quite a simple sort of fashion. So post notes are really important. And as I mentioned, I've worked with the State and Nature Partnership, which is a great big group of scientists and taxa experts and statutory conservation bodies in the United Kingdom to pull together a great compendium of status assessments for the state of nature in the United Kingdom, which acts as a one voice, an agreed baseline assessment of the state of nature, the pressures on it, and actions that need to be taken by government and all of the leading ENGOs, including the museum. Museums are one of our great partners as well. So I've done that to work inside the tent to effect decisions and consideration of environmental policy making. And I've done the same in Europe, so the Common Bird Indicator thing I showed you for Europe, that's described by the EU Commission as a flagship index for biodiversity in Europe. It was the first biodiversity indicator that was adopted and used in Europe, and it's used very, very widely across a whole range of mechanisms of reporting in terms of sustainable development, environmental progress, nature assessment. State of Nature in the EU heavily relies on our information, and increasingly diverse information on other taxa and other information. That birds are not particularly brilliant as indicators, but the programme we've been able to create of collating the information is really pretty brilliant and ahead of the game of everybody else. So I've done that, and you might think, well, what impact has that had? Well, it potentially has really specific impact, because there's a thing quite recently that the EU has set out a new EU restoration law. So a law that would have binding targets within it for the whole of the European Union, for each member state to correspond with. And part of that law relates to those farm and birds I showed you. So the EU law sets out specific time-bound targets for the recovery of farm and birds in all of the EU member states. And it's using that farm and bird indicator as its metric, its honest metric of whether progress will be made. So this is it in discussion in the European Parliament now. But at the bottom here you can see each of the member states is being, the responsibilities are being placed on them to put in place restoration measures for those farm birds, to change the farm bird index, to make it increase by a specific level through time within two different groups of member states. So these are smart targets, and I've been closely talking to the individuals within the EU who are responsible, the desk officers responsible for this law, to help them define the metrics, to define the ambition, to model the ambition. And I've done the same working with people in the UK context and in England to work alongside as part of committees and providing advice and feedback and some contractual work to influence what's called the 25-year plan in the United Kingdom and in England. This is a plan to restore nature so that we have thriving nature in the UK, when we have clean water, we have clean air, and we have a green and pleasant land. But the 25-year plan, it is in fact a very far-sighted, ambitious plan for the recovery of nature and the environment in the UK. And as part of that, I've worked with others in terms of trying to define the level of ambition for nature targets, and then how you measure it. So you can't, as they say, you can't measure, you can't improve what you can't measure, you can't manage what you can't measure. So having an audit trail of what we want to achieve and measurement against it, an audit trail is really important. That allows you to hold people, hold the feet of government to the fire and get change. And that is reflected in the Environment Act. So the Environment Act in 2021 is a parliamentary bill. It sets legally binding targets for the recovery, in fact, the halting of decline of species abundance by 2030, recovery of species abundance by 2042. It sets in law a demand that the extinction risk of species in the UK is improved by 2042, and protected sites are also mentioned within that plan, within something called the Environment Improvement Plan, which is the strategy for implementation. So a lot is happening in the UK and in England specifically to have smart, ambitious targets and have them defined within things called statutory instruments that define the specific target that has to be reached by a level and how it would be measured in law within some legal speak. And we've been involved in trying to influence that. But that sounds quite sort of woolly in a sense. It's just general ambition. But within the Environment Act is this target to set legally binding targets in England to halt species abundance. So it's all right to say that, but how would you measure it and how would you know whether you achieved it? And we've worked with the government, with DEFRA and with UK CEH to explore how you might do that in a quantitative fashion, using indicators of species abundance on the left there, and then thinking about in terms of the biological probability, in terms of biological population growth rates, what we know about species recovery, what could be achieved by different dates, as shown on the right there, and what would happen if we simply use some sort of time series projection and a bit of business as usual. That's the red forecast. If we do nothing, that is the way biodiversity is going in the United Kingdom. So we've worked hard to be propositional and to engage in that debate, to influence it as best we can in terms of the evidence that we understand. And specifically for farm and birds, we've gone a little bit further. For those farm and birds, there's a lot of research, hundreds of papers looking at individual species responses to things we call nature-friendly farming, agri-environmental schemes. and so that we understand species by species how they might respond to a particular rollout of a policy to develop nature-friendly farming. And this is a little bit of modelling work that we did for DEFRA ahead of the Environment Act being published and consultation on it, where we looked at a model that shows you on the left there, you can see the provision of nature-friendly farming would need to increase from the current level to something above about 40% of farms having nature-friendly farming for you to have any recovery of farm burden nets according to our model response. And we can then think about scenarios to say, well, you know, if we want this index to be a certain value in a particular year, what would that mean in terms of how much farming we need to devote to have in place nature-friendly methodologies? So that takes us more to 65, 60, 70% of farms. You'd need to massively increase nature-friendly farming across the UK and in England specifically to recover and bend the curve of biodiversity in a very rapid fashion. And this work is there, and it allows the decision makers and the committees that are informing them, the scientists part of that committee, to make well-informed decisions about what their targets should be and how measurable they can be, how ambitious they can be as well. Standing back a bit, what I've described to you there is essentially what's come under the term of sort of nature positive. Lots of the NGOs around the world, the WWFs of the world and so on, are now talking much more about a world where we need nature positive. A nature positive by 2030 vision takes some indicator of biodiversity, it's undefined here over there, and it takes you from that downward curve that we're seeing now, that's the current measured biodiversity decline across lots of different metrics of biodiversity, and it sees it plateauing out to a rate of change of 0 and then becoming more positive. And you have this thing, this magic net positive by 2030. So we have a caricature like this, a big cartoon shows you what it might look like. There's been a lot of work as well to be much more specific, to be much more precise about what we mean by that. And one of the most important papers was a paper that was led by Georgina Mace, I think, that talked about how we might aim higher to bend the curve of biodiversity loss. That's where this sort of bending the curve narrative, the phrase comes from, and it's really stuck, and it's really influenced debate at many different levels, from the local, the national, to the global in terms of biodiversity response. And the picture here, I've shown you this nice graphic, comes from a paper by David Leclerc and others that took that vision of Georgina and develops scenarios for what the future could look like under different sort of circumstances. And the grey line is that business as usual. If we carry on as we are doing, using our resources, using the environment, exploiting it, we're not living in harmony, biodiversity will keep crashing, and we'll get very high rates of extinction loss, very high rates of abundance loss. That could have really catastrophic ecosystem service consequences. The middle line there, the yellow line, it tells you what might happen if we could really ramp up conservation efforts in the world. That shows that if we were implementing conservation really effectively and at a much higher scale, we can get some recovery of nature. But to really turn biodiversity around, and this is kind of common sense to us all, isn't it? You know, you need those increased conservation efforts, but you need a much more sustainable production of food, much more sustainable consumption. We need transformative change in the whole way we operate the world in order to recover nature back to something resembling some sort of historic levels. So that sort of more propositional scenario work has been really important. And that work, along with lots of other work, was directed and aimed to influence the conventional biological diversity, specifically the big meeting, this thing called the Convention Parties 15, COP15, that happened in Montreal, in Canada at the end of last year. This was a meeting that had been delayed by COVID a couple of years, so it was pushed forward, and it happened in December 22, and it came out with an outcome that I'll describe to you, which was really, I think, influenced by the great work that had been done before, but was genuinely ambitious. It wasn't everything we wanted, but it was really standing back, really, really positive. And some of the work we did in framing that was to think about nature targets and to think about what characteristics of these global targets. We've had global targets 3 or 4 times before and they've failed. So what is it about the formulation, the wording, the structure, the grammar in those targets that makes them work? And we did a piece of work here led by Lizzie Green, where we looked at the IG targets, that's the previous set of 20 targets that the CBD had adopted. And we said, well, to what degree are SMART targets delivering more? So SMART means sort of specific and measurable, ambitious, realistic and time-bound. And we scored all the targets. And we showed very simply, and again in a sort of common sense sort of fashion, that smarter targets deliver more. And SMART targets, again, the currency, it's the narrative, the language that was all through Montreal and in the leading discussions as well. It didn't mean we got SMART targets, in fact, but at least we were there trying to inform the debate. And again, we worked hard with a whole lot of people to make sure that this work is in the peer review science, it's the highest level science, and we're sharing expertise and working in a large, multi-authored, multi-organisation, multidisciplinary fashion in order to inform those targets. And the meeting, COP15, happened, as I said, in December. It produced this thing called the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. You'll hear that just called the GBF. This is a really important landmark decision by 200 countries across the world to set install a plan to recover nature, essentially. And there are so many benefits of that for nature, for people, for climate as well. And the Kunming Biodiversity Agreement came out with these really important elements. And it's quite a big document. It's based around the theory of change, as I described to you before. It's very much based upon that theory of change. And it comes out with a really ambitious mission, a mission to halt and reverse biodiversity loss by 2030. It has a species goal in there to halt human-induced extinctions, to increase the abundance of species to healthy, resilient levels, and then species target to take in urgent action. So it has sort of targets that are then supported by 23 actionable objectives. It has an objective around protected areas, the 30 by 30 thing you may have heard, 30% of terrestrial, 30% of coastal and marine areas, especially those important for biodiversity, effectively conserved and managed. And it has within it a finance plan, an implementation plan. The implementation plan is really important because it requires each country, as a signatory to the CBD, to produce a national biodiversity strategy and action plan, and to develop new national targets. So in the UK, each country in the world will have to work very rapidly now to come up with a new plan for nature recovery based around the CBD. And behind all that is a really strong monitoring framework. And the framework needs to be improved, it has to be said, but there's a monitoring framework, a common monitoring framework with a set of headline indicators so that all parties can measure progress and we can hold them to account for success, for failure, and point to how things need to change and at what scale. So that's the CBD. But the question standing back is whether the inside track works. So I've described to you lots of things I've done, busy, but has it really changed things? And to some degree, there are some successes. Small battles are won, but also the war is often lost. The birds in this picture are common cranes. Common cranes became extinct in the UK 400 years ago, and they naturally colonised and they've come back. And this is a reintroduction programme. So we now have a couple of 100 cranes in the UK, and we've brought them back. and it's an example of effective conservation, of which there are lots and lots across the world, but they're small scale and they're scattered. We need much bigger influence. So does inside track work? Well, I've described how I've done it. We'll need to see whether it does work. But does outside track work? Well, some of you might have been familiar with this, the attack on nature, this campaign that grew in a viral type fashion when Liz Truss and her government came to power in 2022. Liz Truss and her government kind of surprised all of us, I think, in setting out a whole series of environmental ambitions that would essentially remove all protection of species and habitats, green space, of absolutely anything that was green and pleasant in the United Kingdom and in England. So there was a massive backlash to this. Everybody, the conservation organisations, green charities like RSPB, the Wildlife Trust, the National Trust, we were all kind of shocked and enraged. And the tone of our response was perhaps different from how it has been before. It was really quite edgy. It was quite forceful in our language. And this, the thing that became called the hashtag attack on nature, grew and grew, a viral thing, mushroomed. The green charities, of course, we have 15 million members, which are massively larger than any of the political parties. And this had real effect. Soon, we toppled the Liz Truss government, and things were looking rosy. And the specific legislation we wanted removed has now been removed, at least weakened some of it and removed. And I think there was also something to do with economics in that list. Let's take it as a win for the green charities. But it shows, so I think we were surprised by this kind of activism, how effective this has been, and the tone has really changed. I'm sure Tristram will tell us more about that. But there are some questions then for a scientist and somebody involved in science policy and activism, and it includes things like kind of codes of conduct as an employee, as an employer. If you were to, as an RSPB employee, if I was to act to bring the organisation into disrepute, then that's a disciplinary offence. That's a sort of potentially sacking offence. So there are codes of conduct for scientists that need to be considered, and there are kind of careers as well. If you're a leading young scientist, how does it look on your CV and your career development to be an activist? That's part of the debate. And will that benefit you in terms of career development in academia, or will it not? Will it hamper you? So there's some real questions, and there's some questions about your duty as an employee to an organisation, and all organisations will have code of conduct that you may need to be aware of. So this is like nearly my last slide, and I just wanted to sort of stand back because I've kind of raced through describing how I've worked very actively in that space between science and policy and activism. Because depending on how you define activism, a lot of what I've described to you, the work I do, could come under the banner of activism. I haven't glued myself to anything, but I have been really active in that science policy interface. And I think as a scientist personally, I'm really passionate about science having policy impact, affecting politics and being in that debate. I know many scientists, at least, would not be comfortable in that area, but personally, that's where I think I want to have applied use. So in terms of science, well, I think, and I'm using a traffic light system here, so red, amber, green, to explain where I think, what is the role of a scientist? So clearly the role of a scientist, this is obvious, is to support science, the objective, the evidence base, to develop the knowledge base that allows us to make better informed, better environmental decisions, particularly in the context of this conversation. And I think it's very much the role of scientists to be in that policy space as well, to be in that political space. That might be something that is unfamiliar to some of us, but it's an important role for us to play in that sort of box that is the four-box model I described to you. In terms of activism, this is an odd sort of traffic light, but I think it's both yes and no. The role of science has never been so important. The role of scientists in policy and politics has never been so important. At a time of absolute crisis, climate crisis, the nature crisis, our role as scientists is really important. And so I'd encourage everybody to be active in the ways I've talked to you about. But there are limits, I think, to activism and what we might mean by that and what that might mean to you. So I think there are also limits for us to think about how we go forward and how we understand which modes of operation are most successful to bring about the change that we all really want to have. So I think I will leave it there and I'll hand over to Tristram, but thank you for listening.
Thank you so much. We're going to have questions. We're going to move quickly to Wyatt, who is a senior research fellow at the Department of Biology at the University of Oxford, and also an honorary research fellow at CEE UCL. He's an award-winning author, and he's also co-founder of the University of Oxford official LGBT+ staff network. He's an active member of Scientists for Extinction Rebellion and a supporter of Scientists Rebellion, and that's what he's going to tell us about today.
Thank you. So, thank you very much for that warm introduction. I'm thinking, yes, if I can stand here. So, thank you very much for the warm introduction, and it's a pleasure to follow Richard. And I think what I would say is that if you can be inside the tent and do fabulous science and have an influence, that is definitely something that you must do. And we all rely on that. And it's only with that robust science that we actually know how bad things are, but also how we might improve things. So it's important that, Richard, you continue your work with the RSPB and every other scientist in your position. My own field, before my own field, I need to thank people who've been helping me with the slides and research. And here we are, sitting in the road, not glued to it, but we're wearing our trademark white lab coats. Now, many of us only work with data, so we actually had to go and get one. But it's become our trademark, and it's identifiable as a scientist in the same way as when doctors for Extinction Rebellion do their actions. They wear hospital scrubs, and they have bold doctor, anaesthetist, nurse, physiotherapist, and if you need one, psychiatrist. So we have all our job titles in front. We just have a generic, I'm a scientist. So I work on animal behavior, and specifically pheromones. So these are the chemical signals that are used within a species. And I actually had a secret ambition to give this lecture on this stage, but not about climate and biodiversity crisis, but about pheromones. Because one of the most wonderful things, as you may know, is that Darwin was very keen on smell. And in his 1871 book on sexual selection and the descent of man, he's got a wonderful passage about, in the season of love, the crocodile's haunts are filled with a musky odour. Now, you wouldn't get that through an editor now, but it is one example among many where he talks about smells being just as important as the peacock's tail. But in 2018, it was time to start the third edition of the book. But the more I looked around me, I realised that most of the animals that I was going to be writing about were going to be dead very soon, certainly in the lifetime of my student readers. The land habitats were disappearing, the oceans, the coral reefs were in peril both from the rising sea temperature, but also acidification. And surely, rather than writing the third edition, and I am a slow writer, it would be better to try to stop the emergency rather than simply recording it. And that's what led me to join protests. So this is me saying I'm a scientist on my lab coat, and David Attenborough says civilization is on course for collapse, yet the newspapers say nothing. And the reason for the placard is that we're outside News International. That's Murdoch Tower, which faces the Shard at London Bridge. And you could say that we were close to the empire of evil. And newspapers are really behind many of the problems, and of course the other media that Murdoch controls, in particular Fox News in America. And as I was standing there, what was crossing my mind was, you know, that the right-wing press, the tabloid newspapers in particular, are always looking for ways to denigrate and delegitimize climate protesters. It's what they do. And I realized I was almost a tabloid editor's wet dream. All I had to do was look out. I'm white, I'm middle class, and my name is Tristram. It just gets worse. If they were to look at my background, they'd see my life of hardship has taken me from being a student at Cambridge to a lectureship and associate professorship at the University of Oxford for 20 years. But there's more. My natural habitat as a Tristram is Waitrose. And I've not always been a good environmentalist. If they were to look back, they would have seen that until recently, all you had to do was offer me a keynote speech in Japan, and I'd be on the first flight faster than you can say fossil fuel. So basically, there are so many things that make you vulnerable. But nonetheless, it is important to protest. So my plan is to outline the emergencies following Richard's exposition, what governments do, why make peaceful protest, and why scientists should too. And I want to leave you considering that we're justified in peaceful protest, that you might want to join them in one of many, many different ways. It's not all about glue and arrest. And that I also hope you'll speak with friends and family more about climate change. And that even if you're not protesting yourself, that you will go and support those protests with donations and words. So we're really down at the bottom on the Biodiversity Intactness Index, which I think comes from this museum. And 41% or so of the UK plant and animal species have declined since 1970, and the decline is accelerating. It's mostly due to habitat loss, but climate change plays its part. And being an ecologist now really just seems to be about writing obituaries for the species as they go. Now, you've seen this slide already. I liked it a lot too. And in terms of sustainable production and sustainable consumption, those would go a long way towards stopping climate change also. And the reason for mentioning this slide is that conservation only is not enough. We also need to repair the planet. Now, this direct relationship means that the temperature effects of emissions can be predicted. Now, I know you don't need reminding about any of this, but it's important for some of the points I want to make. So, temperature rises are very predictable. And indeed, here is a set of predictions from 1982. And what you can see is in black the predictions of atmospheric carbon dioxide and the temperature effect of that carbon dioxide. And then you can see the observed in the years following 1982. And it's actually a pretty good match. But what might surprise you is this was done by a major oil company, the biggest in the world. And you may have seen this in the news. They had very good scientists who were able to predict precisely how much their product would boil the planet. But in public, they dismissed the idea of global heating. In private, they knew precisely what they were doing. And this leads us to the carbon budget. How much more can we burn and have a possibility, only a possibility, of staying below 1.5 degrees centigrade? And as you can see, we're burning through it at about 1% of the budget every month. Every month. And the resulting temperature rise is simply physics. Kevin Anderson says it's the brutal beauty of physics. You can't argue with it. You can't disappear it by accounting scams that push it into the future and will get going perhaps in 2040. And that includes net zero. And Anderson is very rude about that. But the carbon cut needs to start now. And this is the thing that I really can't get my mind around, because as you look at what governments are doing, there is almost complete inaction. What we need, says Kevin Anderson, is a 10% emissions cut every year from today, not starting next year, from today. And instead of that drop, we're increasing it to about 1.5% per year. And in order to be fair in budgeting our remaining carbon budget with the global south, we need to go faster. And so he suggests that we need to be carbon free by 2033. And it's not about waiting until 2040 or coasting to 2050. And as you'll know from the last 2 years, it's already unpredictable at 1.2. We've seen the floods, most recently, catastrophically in New Zealand and in Brazil. There have been the forest fires in California, Greece. We got 40 degrees in the UK last summer. It was the busiest day for fires in London, the fire brigade's busiest day since the Blitz. It's extraordinary, we just don't expect that. And of course, food insecurity is increasing. And in the future, it might not be just tomatoes in the supermarkets that are missing, it might be a lot more. And of course, all these effects are very much worse in the global south, with the 32 million displaced by floods in Pakistan, and the 22 million at risk of climate-induced famine after 6 years of drought in East Africa. Now, somebody I really admire is Antonio Guterres, former Prime Minister of Portugal, I think. And he's blunt. We must end the merciless, relentless, and senseless war on nature. It's putting our world at immediate risk of hurtling past that 1.5 and moving towards 2.8. And meanwhile, humanity is taking a sledgehammer to our world's rich biodiversity. And he names the guilty parties. No more bottomless greed of the fossil fuel industry and its enablers, which is an important point. And he goes on. He has a special message for them. If you cannot set a credible course for net zero, with 2025 and 2030 targets covering all your operations, you shouldn't be in business. Your core product is our core problem, and we need a renewables revolution. Now, in 2021, the director of the International Energy Agency couldn't have been clearer. He told the governments, if you're serious about the climate crisis, there can be no new investments in oil, gas, or coal from now 2021. So what did governments do? Well, Biden held the largest oil and gas sale in US history. China coal production hit record levels. The UK did Shell's Jackdaw gas field go ahead. And the banking giants, in fact, are the really important ones because they put the finance into everything. And since the Paris Agreement, they put in trillions. So scientists' warnings simply don't work. And the policy is essential, but it really isn't enough. What's the evidence that it's not enough? And it's this. You may have seen it before. We have the years along the bottom from 1960 to 2020. We have the atmospheric CO2 up here, and the CO2 is rising exponentially without limit. We have Ed Hawkins' temperature bands against a pre-industrial average. And what you can see is that 60% of all emissions have been since the first IPCC report. This year is projected to be the highest ever. But what's been superimposed on this are all the agreements. And what you can see is that the slope simply does not break. It's as if those meetings had never happened. It's extraordinary. And it's much the same for the ecological emergency. So what we have here is the years and the diversity. One of the problems with ecology, it's not like physics. So this is a kind of estimation, and there are plenty of problems with it. But basically this is an index with biodiversity in 1970, and it declines. And I've marked the Rio Convention in 1992, and the biodiversity targets of 2010. There were 20 targets for this last decade. We didn't reach one of them. So we really do have a problem in the delivery. So why is there no change? And I think if we were in any other country, we'd simply call it corruption. So scientists go to government with data and information, and that is their theory of change. Lobbyists and corporations go with lots of money. Who is the government going to listen to? Well, actually, what's really weird and distressing is it's not lots of money. So the Conservative parties and MPs have received something like 1.7 million in donations from climate skeptics and fossil fuel interests since the general election in 2019. And that does seem to have been enough to change their policies. So the oil companies get their windfall tax reduced to almost nothing. In fact, because they can invest what they pay in tax in new North Sea oil, and if they do that, they don't pay the tax. But actually there's something hidden here, because it's not just that money. It's also things like the Daily Mail and the Murdoch Press, which actually matter more. And a journalist campaigner called Donica McCarthy has argued that it's this that should be our target of activism. It's this that the government is really scared of. And he's called it almost the prostitute state. And it's only when we can vanquish the Daily Mail and the Murdoch Press that we'll really make progress. So this is the first part of the corruption. And it's very effective, because basically they get an enormous amount of subsidy. So not only are they not controlled, we actually give them money to destroy our world. The second way that corruption works is that scientists go to the people with information, but the corporations deliberately spread misinformation. And their strategy has been to deny doubt, spread doubt, and delay any strategy. And it's the one that you'll be familiar with from tobacco. And it worked beautifully. It delayed controls on tobacco. Exxon knew what it was doing. They knew how much they were boiling the world. And there's a wonderful 3-part series that you can catch on BBC iPlayer called Big Oil versus the World. And you'll end that series having a huge respect for the scientists, but contempt for the executives who basically went out in public and said that global warming or heating did not exist. So the public is uninformed because the media don't cover the issues as emergencies. And there was a famous study looking at all the words said on British television in 2020, and cake was mentioned 10 times more than climate change on UK television. Cake was mentioned about 113,000 times. They went through the subtitles, that's how they did the research. What's even sillier is that banana bread was mentioned more than solar energy and wind power combined. But there was a silver lining. Birds were mentioned almost as often as cake. So they hit 97,000 mentions. But climate was only mentioned about 12,000 times. It is basically, I think, probably just down to Bake Off, but we just don't talk about it. And what this means is we're very well informed about cake, but we don't know that much about climate change and how serious it is in the short term, not the distant future of 2050. And if the public doesn't demand change, then politicians don't deliver it. And the only thing that really seems to cut through is an action like this. And this was, of course, in the National Gallery. That's tomato soup thrown onto Van Gogh's sunflowers. I only wish I could say that Phoebe Plummer on the left is a scientist. But we can't claim her. She's an art historian and she knows what she was doing. The painting was very well protected. But it cut through the media in a way that nothing else seems to have done. And I've had quite a number of conversations with friends who happen to be bankers, disagreeing about the soup, but actually having a moment to talk about climate change when we wouldn't have done otherwise. It really has become a topic of conversation. And this really comes to the focus, the nub of it. Greta sums it up as, I want you to act as if you would in a crisis. I want you to act as if our house is on fire, because it is. And I think it's that sense of urgency which is actually not part of any of our lives. I go to the supermarket, I go through my life, I spend far too much time on Twitter. It's as if the crisis simply isn't happening. And scientists really have tried everything. Who better to ask than the authors of the IPCC? And this was a study, I think, that was in Nature in about 2018 or so. And of the authors surveyed, 81% agreed that that advocacy in climate was important, and that 66% of them engaged in it. And in a bit more detail, what kind of advocacy did they engage in? They promoted science through speeches, publications, they contacted lawmakers, they signed endless letters and petitions, as everybody in this room has. They even participated in demonstrations, a quarter of them. And there is a proud history of scientists getting involved in social and political change. And I just want to mention two here. So the first was fighting nuclear Armageddon in the 1950s. So days after the Nagasaki atom bomb had been dropped, the leading philosopher Bertrand Russell had written, "The prospect for the human race is sombre beyond all precedent. Mankind are faced with a clear-cut alternative. Either we shall all perish, or we shall have to acquire some slight degree of common sense. A great deal of new political thinking will be necessary if utter disaster is to be averted." And I only came across this recently, but what really struck me is this could have been said by Antonio Guterres at the United Nations, or by any scientist or politician now, describing our situation. It describes it beautifully. A nuclear physicist, Joseph Rotblat, was concerned by the development of the H-bomb and the way that things were ramping up in an arms race. And he contacted Bertrand Russell and worked on a test ban. And that resulted in 1955 in the Russell-Einstein Manifesto calling for an end to the arms race, ultimately leading to the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. Signed by 10 Nobel laureates, leading from the front. It included Einstein. And so far as we know, the letter giving his signature an agreement to be part of that declaration was his last act just before he died. And in fact, there's a story that Bertrand Russell had been to see him in Princeton. He came back to Europe, and on the flight, the pilot said, Einstein has died. And he thought, we're sunk, because Einstein is the most famous scientist, and without him, we will lose a lot of influence. But when Russell got back to his hotel, he found that in the post had been Einstein's signature. So he was able to open the letter, and there it was. So that's why we know it was his last letter. Rotblat was given the Nobel Prize, Peace Prize in 1995, and he observed that the idea that scientists should take an active part in world affairs was evidently approved by public opinion. And that should embolden us when we're thinking about how far we should go along the line of activism. The second example is how we got to the Montreal Protocol to ban CFCs. So Sherry Rowland and his postdoc discovered that each CFC molecule from aerosol cans and other sources was going into the stratosphere and could destroy the ozone layer, and that hole was developing. But Sherry actively campaigned to get change. The industry, which had a lot of influence on Congress, was not happy. Sherry really had to campaign, and he was ultimately successful. But what he said in his Nobel Prize speech was this: what's the point of having developed a science well enough to make predictions if, in the end, all we're willing to do is stand around and wait for them to come true? And I can imagine climate scientists around the world and those people working on biodiversity and predicting that downward slope thinking very much the same thing. What is the point in standing around and just watching it happen? Now, why did all those scientist-led campaigns succeed and climate change is resistant? And I think the answer is this: the nuclear test ban was easy because it was only up against two superpowers in the middle of a Cold War. And the CFC ban was only up against a major, rich chemical industry. Think Dow. But what we have with the fossil fuels is the most profitable industry in the history of humankind. And the profits are $3 billion a day for the last 50 years. And the way they've spent that money is to buy every politician on both sides of every government or opposition. They have both the Democrats and the Republicans. And they've used that to delay action on the climate crisis. So scientists have tried everything else. What's left? And that's where we come to the thing which Richard has already mentioned, which is peaceful civil disobedience. So on the left we have the suffragettes, who, it has to be said, were not always peaceful. We have Mahatma Gandhi and the non-violent campaign for the independence of India. We have Rosa Parks refusing to move from her seat on the segregated bus, leading to the Montgomery bus boycott organised by Martin Luther King. But there's a space there, and the space is filled by Bayard Rustin, who's seen there with Martin Luther King Jr. Bayard Rustin was a black gay man. He was brought up a Quaker. He was a lifelong pacifist. He was charismatic, courageous, and an extremely effective organizer. He was the person who ultimately organized the March on Washington, which was the largest march that had ever occurred, and it's the one that's famous for Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream. But in the 1940s, he travelled often to India, studying Gandhi's non-violent techniques for change. He was inspired by them. And as the Montgomery bus boycott was about to happen, he went down to talk with Martin Luther King and persuaded him that the best course of action was peaceful civil disobedience. He went on to be active in all sorts of ways, including a beautiful example of intersectionality, because as a gay man, he was then later involved in the 70s and 80s in gay liberation and in fighting for the rights for lesbians and gays and bisexuals and trans people. So he is somebody I would have loved to have met, and sadly, and he died many years ago. But we always have to remember that civil disobedience is never popular at the time, only afterwards. The suffragettes were reviled, and Martin Luther King was at one point the most hated man in America. The FBI was wiretapping him. He was in danger. Another example is ACT UP, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power. Why was it needed? Well, people with AIDS were homeless, unable to get food, and Ronald Reagan refused to even say the word AIDS. So they carried out a campaign of civil disobedience, and those of you who've seen Pose set in Vogue in New York may remember the scene in the Catholic Cathedral where basically they interrupt a service by lying on the ground, as they are doing here, stopping the service to protest at some of the things the bishop would say. So what they fought for was care for people with AIDS, to take them off the streets, to look after them. They fought for drugs for HIV, and they pushed for fast-track trials. They changed the protocols for drug discovery and trials, which persist to this day, and which helped with COVID vaccines. And at the start, women were not included in the drug trials, but of course women were getting HIV too. And one of their achievements was to get women included. This is another theory of change. Challenging authority is required to get that change. So power is basically given by consent, but it can also be withdrawn. And the idea of civil disobedience is that it creates pressure on the government or authorities, and it forces a dilemma. Will the state repress the people protesting? And that's something which actually with the government legislation at the moment does look as though they're trying to do, to basically make it harder to protest in the UK than in Hong Kong. And then what we hope is that if the protest is widely supported, then change becomes possible because the government actually has no choice. There comes a point at which repression simply doesn't work. And Martin Luther King put it this way: we who engage in non-violent direct action are not the creators of tension. We're not, as it were, blocking roads and annoying people. We merely bring to the surface the hidden tension that is already alive. And Frederick Douglass, who was born a slave, but was a notable campaigner for abolition and became an essayist and public speaker all over the world. He says, "Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will." Guterres says it again, beautifully. Climate activists are sometimes depicted as dangerous radicals, but the truly dangerous radicals are the countries that are increasing the production of fossil fuels. So climate protest has had some effect. There's a debate about how significant. I'd like to think so. So here's Extinction Rebellion outside the Bank of England, protesting about fossil fuels, and when there are floods, people are very concerned about the environment, but actually the complete bringing to a standstill of Oxford Street and the bridges across the Thames by Extinction Rebellion in 2019 actually did bring it up the agenda, because in a way similar to the soup, it actually simply had to be reported and couldn't be ignored. For a brief moment, we changed Theresa May's mind. Not as much of an influence on Truss, but they at least did declare a climate emergency, even if they intended to do nothing about it. And for a brief nanosecond, the Daily Express went green. So civil disobedience seems to work, but what about scientists? Scientists are citizens, so we could be there in that role, but actually I think it's especially important for scientists to protest. And the reason, and it's about the messenger effect. Scientists and academics are among the most trusted people in society after doctors and nurses. We actually have a very good reputation. At the bottom of that list, you may remember, are politicians, journalists, and estate agents. So we're at the other end. So we actually do come from a position of trust. And that's important, because what it means is that if we take action, if we go onto the streets wearing our lab coats so that we're visible, otherwise we do look like everybody else, it shows how serious the situation is. And also, it shows how seriously we take it. Because it would be kind of weird if we thought the world was going to end, and we just thought, well, that's okay, and went on with our lives. It's actually showing that we take it seriously too. The second thing is that scientists lend legitimacy to the climate movement and challenge stereotypes. Because even when you're wearing a lab coat and not looking like a hippie, people will shout out as they go past, "Get a job!" or something. And I'm retired, but my fellow scientists, so I sometimes say, yeah, I would, but my fellow scientists who are actually working do shout back, "I ought to be in the lab, or it's my day off." So the fact that scientists who are trusted are there with the demonstrators adds weight to the protests. And again, there's a distinguished history. So here's Carl Sagan in the 1980s, smiling from the bus and waving. He's been arrested at a protest, I think, in Nevada for a nuclear test. And here's arguably one of the fathers of modern climate science, Jim Hansen, being arrested outside the White House in the protest against tar sands and their contribution to emissions. More recently, and not so far away from here, this is Scientists for Extinction Rebellion. We're outside the department formerly known as the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, and we're responding, we're annoyed, we're responding to the department's recent licensing, this was in April 2022, to new oil and gas licenses. They knew they shouldn't, it was against their own advice and promises in the North Sea. And one of the things we're particularly proud of is the way that we've matched the colour. It actually looks as though we're almost official. I'm sure people walking into the office were sort of wondering about the policy change. But the action was important because it was science-based. And here we see a professor, Stuart Capsick from Swansea, and Abby Perrin, a microbiologist, looking at mitochondrial DNA in plants, I think. I'm a zoologist. But what you can see behind them is blown up, big enough for a minister to read, is a scientific paper, in this case from PLOS, and it's saying, assessing dangerous climate change required reduction for carbon emissions to protect young people. And on each of the windows we had a different paper making a different point about the importance of leaving fossil fuels in the ground. They were glued onto the windows with responsible, water-soluble glue. And in fact, yes, you can't see Stuart's hand because it's actually glued to the glass. I actually have a slight problem because when I started getting involved with Extinction Rebellion, my husband made me promise that I wouldn't try to get arrested. And so far, I've managed that. So I wasn't gluing my hand to the glass. But more about the protest. It was relevant, where scientists were protesting about science. It was proportionate to prevent the greater harm of climate change. It was symbolic. And it was a last resort. All of us have written papers, all of us have written to our MPs, we've filled in endless petitions. This is our last resort. And taking the consequences, the students remained there to be arrested. They couldn't move because of the glue. But that was planned. 9 scientists, the braver ones, were arrested. And I'm now very happy to say that all have now been acquitted, that it was judged that their actions were proportionate. Now, Richard mentioned the very important thing about the entirely understandable anxieties that any individual, as a scientist, or for that matter any other person, has about getting involved in activism. And if you're a short-term contract researcher, it's not just dismissal, it's the renewal of your contract. You also don't have any time. You're writing your next grant. You don't have time to be an activist. There's a worry that it's a bit like coming out. When you sheepishly say on Monday morning, when they say what were you doing at the weekend, and you say, oh, it's glued to it. And if you don't know what your other academics are going to think, you don't want to be the first person to admit that. Another problem is that you're stepping outside your expertise. I know narrowly about pheromones. I didn't really want to talk about climate change because I have to rely on so many other people for that knowledge, and I just have to trust them. One thing that people worry about a lot, and this comes back to this idea of scientists as objective observers, stood away from the data and impartial, is that we'll lose credibility. And there have been a number of surveys which suggest, paradoxically, that actually it can increase credibility because the public expect us to act. Knowing what we do, they would be surprised if we didn't. But I think what's really important, and this addresses Richard's question also about the anxieties, senior people in universities need to take those anxieties away. And instead of being shamed by activism from their staff members and students, they should be proud. And what they ought to be doing it is recognising it as legitimate, rewarding it in hiring and promotion, not penalising it, teaching civil engagement to students, although they mightn't be keen on the protests that result. And they ought to be defending academic activists when they do get arrested, should that happen. And I actually love this placard, where this is Abby, the plant mitochondrial DNA person, saying that she's frightened that our government would rather imprison scientists than follow their advice. And I think that's the pithiest comment yet. So here is somebody being arrested. She's Emma Smart, a fish biologist and appropriate for this museum, a taxonomist. But she gave that up to become a climate activist, and she's also been involved in Just Stop Oil. So here she is being carried away from the department formerly known as Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. But what Extinction Rebellion had to recognise very early is that the costs and risk of arrest are not the same for everyone. If you're a person of colour, or you have caring responsibilities, you simply cannot take the same risks. And so you need to be home to look after your family. So one of the things that Extinction Rebellion and other protest movements have rapidly recognised is there are so many ways of getting involved, and that's among the ways that I've been involved. And these include all sorts of things. So there are so many ways that you can get involved because the action simply can't happen without lots of people, the rest of the iceberg holding up the tip of the people who are actually actively in the protest. And one of the most important things is getting the message out. There is no point in having a protest if nobody knows. And so the public outreach, the press liaison and the social media are crucial to actually give any value, lasting value to any protest, whether or not there are arrests. And one of the things that actually is something of debate the whole time now is once you've had one fish taxonomist carried away from the Department for the Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, once you've had one such scientist carried away, the next time you need two. And it's actually a real problem because we don't know now how to get the media's attention. And I think that's why people move to sue. It's actually a real problem. And when we had a demonstration outside DEFRA, we didn't get arrested. We talked nicely to the police and they said, okay, if we washed the posters off the, these again were scientific papers, if we washed them off the windows, they wouldn't arrest us as long as it was done by noon. And then we had the building manager come out and he said, look, they look cleaner than they were before. So we brought our squeegees and we did a very good job. But there were some people in the briefing afterwards, some scientists, who were actually disappointed that nobody had been arrested. And we had to say in the end that actually it had been a very good protest because it did hit some of the news. And what we'd done is say to staff in DEFRA that we supported then. What we disagreed with was the minister's policy, that we admired what they were doing in the stuff, but not what was happening at policy level. Okay, it's important that we as scientists do support those that protest, almost on our behalf. And this was a 30-second or so interruption of a conference, the annual conference of the American Geophysical Union in the States. On the left is Peter Kalmus, on the right, scientist Rose Abramoff. And the response to the conference was to ban these two from the conference. They got down from the stage as soon as they were asked to, but they banned them from the conference and actually took them out of the abstract book and sort of made them unpersons. And in response, there was an extraordinary letter writing campaign. 2,000 scientists from around the world, including Jim Hansen, who you remember had been arrested outside the White House, basically calling out the Geophysical Union for, on the one hand, having a policy which said they were very concerned about climate change, and on the other, behaving so draconianly when it was brought to their attention. So after the uproar, the society backpedaled, and they are now in discussion with Peter and Rose about how they might take things forward. But today, where are our learned societies and our most famous scientists and the NGOs? Are they really speaking out loudly? And the answer is not really. They organise wonderful conferences, but they don't speak out. And if you look through the press releases of the preeminent organisation in this country, the Royal Society, you will not see a single criticism of government policy. And that's a real shame. And if they tell you that it's all because they're working behind the scenes, just show them that. Because what that tells me is that all those quiet words have not brought results. And of course there could be costs. You might not become Sir, Dame or Lord, but what you have to remember is there are no grants or honours on a dead planet. So scientific evidence in court can help, especially when juries and judges are allowed to hear the science and the seriousness of the situation. Now this is an action actually about the Royal Society. It was carried out by Tim Hewitt and Mike Lynch-White, who were co-founders of Scientist Rebellion. It was a symbolic action with green paint, and Martin Luther, they pinned a manifesto talking about rebel truth and demanding that the Royal Society speak out. What's interesting in my own evolution is I thought when I saw this at the time in 2020, how rude. I wouldn't do that. And I've actually come around to thinking that it wasn't such a bad idea. When it came to court earlier this month, the only defence that they were allowed by the judge was the belief in consent. And basically what they had to do was convince the jury that the Royal Society, if they had known how serious the climate emergency was and how effective non-violent protest was, that the Royal Society would have consented. And what's amazing is the Crown Court jury agreed, and they were both acquitted. But George Monbiot, in an important article, says that if you can't raise those issues in court, then basically it's not telling the whole truth. And one of the defendants in a recent trial said, it's as if you had hit someone in self-defense but were not allowed to say you were being attacked. The judge refused our only two defenses, necessity to act and proportionality. How can we talk about this action without saying why we did it? Scientists are saying that actually we can no longer carry on as normal. Scientists must act on our own warnings. Peter Kalmus, who you saw on the stage, is there locked to the doors of a bank, and what he says is that it cut through the distractions of everyday life, and people started to notice that. If you're interested in the motivations of scientists who become activists, there's a great podcast series by Peter Knapp, who's gone back to being an air quality scientist doing a PhD. And if you search tipping points and Peter Knapp, you'll find him. So, I've got about 5 more slides, and I will be finishing soon.
We need some time for questions.
Yeah.
I need my time. So, RSPB, and it wouldn't be fair not to mention them. So, we think of them now as a pillar of the establishment. But actually, as you may know, it actually started as a protest. And it was Emily Williamson who was protesting about the extinction from bird feathers, or rather, the birds died when the feathers were taken. And with 3 other women, she started the Society for the Protection of Birds. And in 1921, they had success with the Plumage Prohibition Act, banning the import of plumage. But what I was really pleased to see, and Richard, you actually mentioned this towards the end of your talk with the war on nature, is that the RSPB came out and said that non-violent direct action is important and it's how things have changed, and that they supported the campaigns to stop the government passing the public order bill. So, last 2 slides. I hope you feel that justifying out, and I hope you might even join them. What's really important, because it's the thing we don't talk about, we're far more likely to talk about cake. And I hope that you'll support the peaceful process, even if you're not protesting yourself. Scientists are citizens too. And Jonathan Porritt says, basically there's no moral universe in which business as usual can continue. Either we start doing everything we can, or we don't. And in the next quote, which I won't put up, he basically says he can see no alternative to mass action. And he's about as establishment as you can get. So whether you're a scientist or not, 21st of April to the 24th, we're going to be meeting outside Parliament. We're hoping that that 15 million membership of the green NGOs, the RSPB, National Trust, Wildlife Trust, everybody will join in. If you go to Linktree Darwin Debate, possibly with lowercase letters, you'll find links to all the things that I've been talking about, probably including the slides, and the QR code will do the same. And thank you very much for listening and for the extra time.
But we want to have a little debate because that is what we're here for. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to skip all of my questions. We're going to set this up and we're going to open the floor already for questions for you. I've been moderating. We can already start with your questions.
Two speakers come and sit down with you. Or still you can stand up if you want. You've got the option of sitting down. So questions or comments?
We don't have any microphones.
It's just this.
This is all okay.
While we're counting biodiversity, I think we should look at the elephant in the room. And is that not economic growth? Is the fact that the whole world is revolving around that. Rishi Sunak wants to cut down the debt and the inflation. That's what I'm looking for.
Yes. Yes, so it's absolutely got to be the case that if we want to change the world, we have to also change the economic model that it operates on. But as we've heard from both myself and Tristram, getting change is massively difficult. But that is absolutely one of the areas we want to go to. And I suppose it's kind of like, I'm a conservationist, but what counts as conservation, what's in our sort of range now is broadening all the time, including economies.
Yes, one of the things that Extinction Rebellion tried to do from the start was not be prescriptive. So they've always asked for citizens' assemblies and getting effectively a jury of the general public listening to expert advice to come up with a decision. And I think that one of the things that would come out of that, I'm sure, is degrowth. Scientist Rebellion is rather different, and they've gone for degrowth and basically, yes, we have to end growth, and they've advocated that from the start.
I just wondered if, because given the Royal Society was specifically mentioned, I wondered if you wanted to make any comment at all, or you felt you want to feel free not to. But I thought I should give you a question. I suspect they build up pay grades. Okay.
What would you think we should be doing as a society?
Did everyone hear that question? So, what do the speakers think the Royal Society should be doing?
Well, I think engaging in the debate would be a good start, wouldn't it, as we are doing here? So that would be a nice thing for the Royal Society to convene the debate, to provide the space and the authority to allow it to happen. That's right, so.
They arrange the best conferences and the most fabulous biscuits. I enjoy them a lot. I don't think another talking is actually what's needed. What I think is that the President of the Royal Society should be speaking out in the way that Guterres is. He has plenty of authority, and it's not just Bayesian statistics. He actually has a position of huge authority, and if he was being as blunt as Guterres is, saying to the government that the science means you cannot do that, it would actually carry a huge amount of weight. David Attenborough, a fellow of the Royal Society, has in his later career started to do that, and he has a platform. I'm delighted he's doing it. But I think senior academics around the UK are not in danger So why are they not speaking out? We know that speaking in private simply hasn't had any effect.
One of the slides that you showed Tristram earlier with the kind of the chart of the public's interest or awareness of climate change being an important factor, where there was that spike from the flooding. The main thing I took away from that was the fact that it almost immediately returned to rest. So at what point do you think, or what can be done to ensure that this doesn't become just a transient thing that comes in and out of the public memory? To actually make it a lasting.
So the question is, public interest shot up when there was flooding, and then it shot down again immediately after when the water went. And I think it's one of the biggest questions. I don't think we know the answer. It's a bit like the problem of how do you get the media's attention? And that's why we really ought to be campaigning to change the media. It's all owned by people with other interests than ours. And until we can do something about that, I don't know. But how we keep it on the front page and how we keep people's attention, I think, treat it more like cake.
Well, I suppose it reminded me of the fact that Tristram mentioned that birds were mentioned as much as cake. Why is that? Well, it's because we have a really well-developed communication policy and process. And I was talking on BBC Radio this morning about parakeets and peregrines, and last week on something else. So you need. So as scientists, I think it's really important that we communicate, and we communicate more often, different fora, to sort of have a public debate on issues. And maybe in the climate world, we aren't getting there yet, because birds were mentioned more than climate change.
Hey, when you were talking about how the fossil fuel companies give their money to all the different parties, you mentioned Republicans and Democrats, which is obviously the case. Joe mentioned it's the reason nothing ever happens in America. But you didn't mention, obviously, Tories versus Labour, and obviously green economy is part of Labour's platform. Do you feel like that they are actually just as bad, though?
I think one of the threats from Jeremy Corbyn was that he had a huge membership party which no longer relied on donations from a small number of rich interests. And now we have a party that has a declining membership and I do think is more influenced by the donors. I think Labour does have a much better policy than the present Tory one, and I just hope they will carry it out. It's not as ambitious as the 2019 manifesto, and I think they've rowed back from many of the things. For example, we may well have to nationalise the energy grid to make the changes that we want fast enough, and I don't think that's part of Starmer's policies. So I don't think they're equally bad, but I'm not super optimistic that things would change a lot, or fast enough, which I think is the important thing.
I wouldn't add anything.
Yeah, thank you. Duncan McCarthy, Climate Media Coalition. 2 points. Tristram, you praised the scientists at Exxon and then condemned the executives. But didn't the scientists hold some responsibility by not speaking out and staying silent? Don't they have a guilt for not doing that? And second point, Richard's point, you said that we have 15 million people join the environmental movement in the UK. And you showed graph after graph of their attitude of not being on the streets protesting had utterly failed. The RSPB, during its history, has presided over the decimation of the bird populations in this country. Is it not time? You've made a good case for science, but you didn't make the good case for RSPB not being out on the streets. I think that's what we need, and it's shameful that they're not. We must get you out there. Thank you.
Well, just to respond, I didn't talk about our strategy going forward. I talked about kind of my science and the bit I do, to be honest. And we have a strategy that has within it as one of the main pillars, empowering people to get out there. Our new strategy is entirely around kind of activism, although we don't use the activism word, we use all words around it, like passion and empowerment, in order to make it happen. And that attack on nature, the example I showed you of how that was effective, it is a new way of doing things. So, as somebody in biodiversity monitoring, you've got to get used to the annual update on the Farm and Bird Index or the state of nature. And people say to me, don't come to me again this year with another state of nature that just shows, things going down. But it's massively difficult to turn those things. You've got a massive kind of super tanker thing to move round, to change in order to get action. But we're very much, I didn't really talk about it, but a lot of the RSPB's work is hands-on work to change, ecosystems and species and landscapes and laws behind it. So, but the challenge, perhaps we should be doing a lot more and being much more active.
So I was actually hugely impressed with the attack on nature response. And what I would hope is the RSPB would actually be emboldened that it was popular and it might well be popular with many members. And I think it could be that you could carry them to places they haven't been before. And I think it's worth a try. I think there's potential for a lot. Donoghue, you mentioned the scientists. Watching the programs which that I mentioned, Big Oil versus the world, the scientists actually do feel some shame. And looking back, they do have regrets. And the people who don't are the lobbyists. And they are as slimy as ever. And they have no regrets, and they do it again at the drop of a hat. So I think the scientists actually do think that they should behave differently. I think the problem is whistleblowers get destroyed. We've seen that again and again. And I think the law in America is much better, but in the UK, whether it's in the NHS or any other industry, it's a huge personal risk, sadly.
I think it's interesting the question of whether the tent you're in, to use a tent analogy, when you decide that tent is actually not a tent you want to be in at all, and the people in the tent with you are not serving the interests of society. And I guess maybe that's what happened to the Exxon Mobil people. They suddenly realised that maybe too late, it's a tragic story that the tent they're in is actually not serving society or the
and I think any good policymaker, advocate, tells you how they change tactics on a daily basis, daily, hourly basis in order to try and get change, whether you're inside the tent or outside the tent, and how you're building complex relationships in a complex, irrational process of decision making. It's not at all easy, is it? So, we are working hard there, but it isn't easy.
We're keen to get questions from all of the board, not just from the front. So,
Hi, so you mentioned that there are some groups of people who there are obvious barriers to them getting actively involved in activism, and I couldn't help but notice that a lot of the slides you put up of people taking part and people being arrested were white people. I was just wondering what you do as an organisation to help protect and ensure a diverse group of people can be actively involved in activism, especially when the climate crisis largely is going to have the biggest impact on minority groups.
It's a challenge, again, that has concerned Extinction Rebellion from the beginning. It's true of many other environmental groups. One of the approaches was to have XR unified, and that's black-led and has a largely black and people of colour membership. So far as people arrested, in a way it's almost owning the privilege that the people who still at great cost to themselves have least to fear in terms of their lives are the people who have to put themselves forward. And one of the questions is, for something like Extinction Rebellion, is it responsible to ask everybody to to get arrested? And the answer is no. So I think we're moving away from that. And the action happening in April from the 21st to the 24th in Parliament Square, you don't have to book, you can just turn up. That is part of the process of trying to open things. And so the barrier to entry, it's not a protest that is going to lead to arrests, that's not our intention. And the idea is that everybody can come along. So it's something that we're certainly very much aware of. And we just need to do better, and the best we can.
Richard, do you have a comment, Richard, as well?
Well, just to reflect on how important that kind of diversity is, the recognition that that diversity has to be part of the solution of how we might achieve anything kind of on a global scale or a national scale. So massively important for the conservation movement and kind of organisations like RSPB who we look at ourselves and our membership and we massively need to improve diversity.
Thanks. This is a follow-up question for Richard. Can you speak to the inclusivity within the tent and if there's anything we can do to improve that?
You mean the people that I work with? Do you mean, or
I mean
with
policy makers and people who are actually making the policies and that you're interacting with on that level?
Well, I think there's greater recognition with all the actors that we work with that having a better understanding of diversity and EDI in terms of how we operate and how we make decisions and how we move forward and include people, you know, in terms of sort of nature connection and barriers that there are out there and the conservation movement and the fact, you know, if you look at the RSPB membership, it's a certain group of, you know, kind of middle class white people of a certain kind. So we're massively working to try and diversify that and work in different ways. Does that answer that?
You've got another question here, actually. Does it answer your question?
Yes, but I might come to you separately with more. Thank you.
I wondered whether the Green Coalition of the big charities was going to continue to develop strategies to lobby government as a large entity of really powerful voices, and what the next steps were for that kind of coalition.
I don't know specifically, but I think the answer is absolutely yes. So there's a much greater recognition that kind of all these disparate actors with overlapping interests acting individually is a really bad recipe for getting anything done. So having a joint voice, a grouped voice, you know, on these issues, particularly in the environmental sector and biodiversity, is massively more powerful, and it's massively more useful for the recipients, for the governments and the civil servants and the policymakers who can then they get a single message about what it is we want, because we're often really poor at describing what it is we want as an environmental organisation. So there is, and we're doing it more and more, you know, partnership is the way forward.
I think that coalition is a wonderful thing and could be incredibly powerful. And what it reminds me of also is the way that you need different kinds of organisations. So in the campaigns for lesbian and gay equality, we have on the one hand outrage with Peter Tatchell interrupting bishops' meetings and doing all sorts of things like that. And then on the other hand, we had Sandy Toksvig and Ian McKellen in Stonewall, who were doing the parliamentary route and being nice. The combination was really effective, and it helped get us civil partnerships and ultimately gay marriage. And the IPCC has recognised that social movements pushing for change are an incredibly important part of getting those changes. And Merkel said the same, that it was the action on the streets that helped her get things through her government, because she could point to these protesters and say that there was a pressure to make change. So I think a combination of the green charities, the kind of respectable stonewalling kind of side, and Extinction Rebellion sort of outragey side, could actually be very effective in combination.
Can I ask a
Yes, of course, I was just gonna say.
follow-up question? So that's a very interesting thing, and I think it's very clear from your position that you both have decided how you are gonna contribute to responding to the emergency. And there's a huge respect with the other. What would have to change for you to take the position of the other? What would have to happen in the world for you to decide that actually I would make more of a difference on the other side?
I'm not sure, to be honest. I guess we, as a scientist, you kind of come from a world that you see as being a very logical framework where rational decisions based upon the best information are made. But as you learn more, the more you understand that the world operates in an irrational fashion, regardless of the evidence and so on. So maybe I'm going to be gluing myself to the window soon. But I suppose it's an area where, as a scientist, you kind of look into your own soul about what you want to achieve and what you feel about it. And the world's changing so fast, isn't it? I think. So that's partly why it's nice to be here to have this debate. And maybe it's the sign. This is a sign of change.
We do have a lab coat your size.
What would make you become engaged actively with policymakers?
I'd be very happy to. I'm a slow writer, and I admire people who can write succinctly and persuasively. And that, if I could bring my skills, I'd be delighted to do more. So if there are opportunities, I'd certainly take them.
Take you up on it.
So I think carrying around as scientists is, I also think, personally I think of scientists as advocates for nature, whatever your type of scientist you are, whatever type of scholar you are. And I think that's, at the moment, a real challenge, knowing what's happening to the world. I think there is a passionate individual response to this, which goes beyond science, which is you as an advocate for us as advocates for beauty and for complexity and nuance in the world that I think has been probably destroyed by some of the populist movements that are seeking to demonise protest and to put a wedge between rationalism and activism. Anybody wants to go? Have we got time for? I'm just going to have a few. I feel like I don't want the debate to stop. So.
I just had a question about what do you think, because a few years back we used the word strike a lot when it came to climate, when it came to climate strikes. Now we're obviously in the midst of just massive striking. Do you think bringing back that word could give more legitimacy and more public recognition to the protests? So changing the word protests for the word strike, how could it change the way the public views what we're doing?
I think that's a really interesting idea. In a way, something that I think has been suggested is it No Purchase Friday or something? Basically, striking from the economy. I think one of the problems is that so many people don't have jobs to strike from, or simply cannot afford to strike, and that's actually one of the dilemmas for NHS staff and others at the moment. But as an idea, I think that's, perhaps it would be a strike in terms of withdrawing consent.
Yeah, I'm not saying about strikes in their own right, I'm just saying about kind of changing the nomenclature and kind of changing what it's seen like, because strikes are seen as quite a legitimate protest because you cannot continue with your work, with whatever you're doing, that's why you're going to strike. This is not a decision that anyone takes lightly, right? So a protest is something that, oh, they're protesting, so they have some kind of an issue, nobody really cares what the issue is. But when it's a strike, it's a legitimate concern that prevents people from doing their work because something bad is happening.
Yeah.
That's why I'm just thinking about that.
No, thank you. Interesting idea.
Richard, did you want to say anything about that?
Well, I suppose it sort of it touches on the fact kind of words and simple words can be so important and can make the difference between a viral success and something having huge impact or something having no impact, sort of a butterfly effect. So, and I think the other thing, it reminded me of the fact that kind of one of the things the RSPB is doing now is to develop a whole series of people's assemblies, which we talked about, in order to to get a groundswell, a bottom-up sense of the priorities, and then engage with those priorities, you know, to go further, which kind of speaks to what is important, you know, kind of in the nomenclature and the process, what really matters to people, because we're representing society in that fashion.
I think we'll take just maybe one more question.
Hello, thank you very much for both of your talks. It's very interesting. I'm kind of interested in like how both of you measure the impact of the things that you do. So I know you both have the same long-term goal, but short-term, like Richard, before you engage on a new policy, what targets do you set yourself? And Tristram, before you plan a new progress, what targets do you set as a result of the protest or as a result of the policy, as a result of your engagement?
So I suppose we are, in the work we do, we're always setting ourselves targets in terms of kind of a project evaluation from cradle to grave, and obviously I do indicators all the time, so indicators, specific indicators are there of success. I suppose one of the things that occurs to me in lots of the conversation we've had is that, like in the conservation world, we're often not very good at measuring how good we are at doing something or how bad we are, and there's a lot of new work. I've done work with UCL colleagues at the RSPB, at UCL and CEE and so on, looking at kind of counterfactual responses and trying to measure, you know, what is your response compared to some baseline. So like the slide you showed with the climate agreements, where's the counterfactual? What would have happened if you had not had those agreements in place? And we've done similar analyses in terms of conservation to think about counterfactual and to try and assess in a better way, work out what works and why it works. I think as a conservation movement, we've often been quite bad at that because we're so emotionally driven to do something, to act. We don't always measure how well we've acted to know how you could improve how you act going forward.
It's very hard to measure. I don't think we do enough. We do have some social scientists who've been doing things like quantitative measures of people's interaction with protests and whether any of the bystanders actually know what's going on. And it turns out actually quite often they don't, because we're so bad at actually getting leaflets out. So we do have people who are looking at that and how to increase the effectiveness. Sometimes it is a little bit like claiming the fall of Truss's government. We did get the climate emergency declared by the government, but actually, in a funny kind of way, that was a Pyrrhic victory because nothing followed. Everybody felt good, but I'm not sure we really achieved anything. And I suppose we'll know when the last oil drill is stopped. But that's not something to keep us going in the meantime. So I think we do need to think about ways we can keep our own momentum and actually see that we are making progress, but it's often very hard to see. And the number of retweets on social media is not a very good measure. We don't know if we've changed minds. So, no, very good question.
Okay, thank you so much. Did you have something else to say? I think that we'll stop here. I think that was really interesting to talk and dialogue. Now, I hope everybody will just continue talking about this. We have a wine reception right here, right? Outside. Talk to people you don't know, and continue the conversation.
So please continue this conversation amongst yourselves. And when does the wine reception finish? How long do you have? Aidan,
do you want to talk?
Sorry, Connie.
I can do the boring housekeeping, yeah. But first of all, just thank you. It's been, as a member of music and staff member here, I'm very proud to have hosted this event today. I think it's one of the most important subjects for humankind, really. So for the wine reception, it's till 7:30, so we are a bit behind time, so do drink and ask you when you want to leave, there is a staircase just outside the store. Please leave through that staircase, not go through the main museum, because security will get very cross. Apart from that, enjoy it and continue the discussion, and thank you to the speakers.